health. And so I'm afraid that Mr. Harbour, along with his cohort of conservatives, have created a lovely aesthetic cloud called maternal health and development in Africa, and in fact it's an empty cloud. So we ought not to be misled by that. So there are 3 instances of where I would say that in the last 6 years we really have fallen behind in our commitments to overseas engagement, in particular towards Africa, where the women of Africa in the maternal health program have been exploited explicitly and used as the poster children of the Harbour government's attempt at development, where in fact they're not getting the help and support they need. And what I would like to say, therefore, is that what we need to look at is really not only a change in government, but a change in international stance. And that's really only going to come with a Liberal win. And the reason I say it's only going to come with a Liberal win is because the NDP has not come out with any significant international devotions. So although it has the end poverty and it has the sort of international commitments to ending poverty and illiteracy that we all have, there's no explicit commitment to the kind of roles that we're going to play in a nation like Africa. And yet the Liberal Party is the party that's come out with explicit ideas about how we can engage not only in the Middle East, but with what Adam was saying, the economic burgeoning locations in Africa like the Sudan. So we know that China is in the Sudan now exploiting mines and resources. We know that mega oil and gas companies are in the Maghreb and in North Africa exploiting oil and gas resources there. And we know that Canada and Canadian companies are largely excluded from that exploitation. And what we want to make sure is that Canada has a hand in those trade negotiations. Canada has a hand in that exploitation if it's going to happen, so that it's as sustainable as possible. And so that when it does happen, it's not going to create a cycle of violence and exploitation domestically that leads to more conflagration and more civil war. So there certainly are roles for Canada. And I have to say to you that as a Liberal member, certainly in Canada as a citizen, I'm shocked at the lack of engagement by this government in Egypt and in Syria and in Libya right now. And Syria, I say, because within Syria for a number of years now, there's been room for engagement. And it's the one country that people say of all the democracy movements going on in the Maghreb and Middle East, it'll never happen in Syria. But in fact, I think that's not truly the case. There are rumblings now. And yet we've had absolutely no statement on this status of affairs. So the status quo is not acceptable. We know it's not acceptable, yet Libya is up in arms, Egypt has been up in arms, Algeria and Tunisia are having their democracy movements, and we've completely, as the Globe and Mail would say, been left out of this democracy movement by choice. And we have to get back to an era where, like Chrétien and like Axworthy and like Pearson before them, we had an active dedication not only to international engagement, but to ourselves as being primary among the internationally engaged countries. And so that's what I would like to end on, and I certainly would like to invite questions from the audience and participation on what you think actually a Liberal Party government, but also any government in Canada ought to be doing in Africa and the Middle East by connection. So thank you very much, and what we're going to do... What we're going to do is, I think we can all take questions from the audience, but we can also take statements, because part of the idea for the next 20 minutes or so is to actually get feedback from you. I've made the argument within my party that we actually have to have a more explicit stance on international affairs in this election. So I would like to hear from you, because everything you say is being reported right back to Ottawa in terms of what we think needs to happen here, because of the large African population in Calgary and because of the population factor that it could change the outcome of elections if we were to activate it. So, who would like to begin? Yeah?
One of the things
do you want to just stand up?
I think one of the things we really have to do is we go back to the Liberal parties, Trudeau and Lloyd Axworthy, who represented the area I lived in Winnipeg. We've lost such an international flavor in the world. I mean, they were true statesmen, both of them. And we haven't had that since then, and what Peacekeeper is saying is that they're leaving us out. Why? Where are we going with this? We need to get back at that. You know, we want those saves, we want those stands, and get respected again. Right now, we're just kicking around with the soccer ball. And we need to go that. I think the Liberal Party's got a way of doing that, getting it back that way.
Well, I would add something to that. I mean, recently Paul Martin was here in Calgary, so some of you may have seen that on the news. And when we were talking about international engagement, actually, Paul was saying, you know, if you look at the IMF and the discussions, because he's an advisor on the IMF Council now, if you look at what they're discussing right now, what they're discussing is really the instability of Europe. Right? The instability right now financially of Europe, and just how precarious the state is for the UK, for France, and for Ireland. Countries that are quite, especially Ireland, quite near to the brink of bankruptcy. I mean, the banks are government owned now, the situation is untenable. But looking at Canada, the situation could, in theory, become untenable without some serious cutbacks to the kind of conflagration, kind of shocking spending that's going on in terms of military aircraft and so forth and so forth. So he was making this argument, and he said, but at the IMF, a concomitant discussion is about the stability, the interesting stability and up-and-coming economic drive found in Africa and certainly in Asia. And so when you take a look at India and China, just how strong those economies are coming out of what wasn't really a serious recession for them in the first place. And you look at Africa and the primary resource-driven nature of countries like the Sudan, and certainly countries like the Congo, though they're still lacking certain governmental structures. You look at these countries, and Paul was saying, effectively what you've got here are some very interesting economies that are developing, and they could actually be the markets that generate the stability for the future in terms of sustaining the primary resource trade network with countries like those in Europe and North America. And yet I feel that here in Canada we've had absolutely no discussion about how the axis of trade is going to be shifting less and less so from Canada and the United States, more and more so to Canada and East Asia and Africa. And that's certainly something to be discussing, and I feel that only returning into an era like Trudeau or Pearson or Axworthy and Chrétien are we going to get that robust discussion.
Good evening, everyone. As you'll see, honored speakers, and my name is Rob. And I would just like to bring up. I think it's important. It's there's the Africa, North Africa. There's the Middle East, and there's the U.S. and there's North America. We've over 200 or 400 years. We've taken control of it, and we've had all the space and freedom to develop technologies, gone to the moon, and we brought over Einstein, and he got the general relativity in 1915, and so we learned that he didn't even know. He thought that the universe was in a constant state, but in 1927, I believe it was Hubble, saw with the redshift that it was expanding, that they've got this Big Bang theory now where if it was expanding, possibly it's all going to come back into gravitation, where Einstein said well, it was space-time was curved and gravity does it. And when it comes back into small, it's going to, we won't know what time is because space-time is going back to this little mass density. But here's what we know. You see this massive universe that we see through the Hubble telescope. Okay, we've got, they've got this little controversial thing, separation of church and state. And, okay, the actual question is, does God exist? Because it's so massive, and we're so just less than nothing here in this universe that we have to readjust this. It's more than Galileo when the big revolution there, when he started looking out at it. And this is.
So you're saying that we're quite small in the grander scheme of things, that there's no solution.
And we made this religion up.
Yeah.
We made it God maybe to build it all. And that's still a big thing of human fighting, because God protects us. We're told it was all God told him what to do.
So, is there a question then for one of the panelists in terms of
the question is, do we need to rethink the whole thing and just kind of nip all the spires off of everything and say, okay, we can build them up, but there ain't nothing coming down particularly. We've got to use our own heads all the world over.
Sure.
And this is what, it became so vast with all the communications in North Africa and the other countries, Syria. They got on their Twitter, they saw a little what's going on. Everybody gets on the internet. They're going to be able to just Google 1,000 years of European history in a week.
I'm going to extract the question from what you're saying, though, and in essence the question is, when we're looking at this, are there simple human solutions to what seems like a mega difficult area of concern.
It's resources. Everyone, we're very
Finding
massively
harnessing the
populated.
resources to solve problems.
Sometimes we can look at the big picture and say, okay, there's problems in a lot of places in the world, probably in space, because right now, our pollution goes up, whatever else. The reality is, we got some problems we can solve here, very close to home. If you look, for example, we're not getting our share here in Alberta, all of you. And I don't know if you saw the article in the Calgary Herald on the 6th of April. We are shortchanged from the federal government, $900 million a year on the health front. This is one of the things we need every day. We're not happy with the health we have system like this. And what's important here is, you got to remember, if we're shortchanged $900 million a year, that's $240 per person in Alberta. But it's part of this equalization division that goes on to the provinces and whatever else. All the money goes in. I just want to explain to you, because you may not understand this. Of all the taxes we pay, 7 cents of each dollar goes to your municipality, and they supply everything you need every day. Your water, your sewer, your garbage, your police, your streets, your whatever, fire service, whatever. 36 cents of every dollar of taxes goes to the provincial government. And they supply education, and they're part of the Canada Health Act is actually half. The other half is federal government, and so on, and they supply other things. Now, 57 cents of every dollar, that's the majority, goes to the federal government. What are we getting for it? And if we spend most of that money onto military, we're missing out on a pile of other things. And on the health front, I can tell you there's a big hole in Stephen Harper's calculation, and the hole is $11 billion now. And he's already said, before he was even at the level he's at now as the Prime Minister, that the Canada Health Act should be squashed. So I think this is the next thing that's going to go, and people should be armed with this one alone. Never mind anything else. This is the contribution. The Canada Health Act puts the Government of Canada as the 5th largest provider of health in Canada. I know, when I was with the RCMP, I broke a finger. I had 2 operations. They covered me. They covered prisoners in jails. They cover military personnel. They cover First Nations and whatever else. The food chain is stamped by inspectors. Health Act, 50% plus they should be contributing. We're not getting our share. Now, what's important here is this election. There'll be the next government that will re-divide the pie, and that has to be done by 2014. It'd be very important to have somebody who has interest in the health service. And like I said, there's all kinds of other things I can swamp you with things, but on the health front, we're going to be shortchanged with Conservative government, guaranteed.
There's actually another thing that we can say locally, and I'm just going to add that, and then we'll go to questions there. With regards to the expenditures, back to what are we getting out of our value, and certainly on the international front, people say, oh, but Stephen Harper and the Conservatives are really devoted to international affairs because we're buying a whole bunch of fighter aircraft. Right? What do those fighter jets do? First of all, for the amount of money being spent on those jets, and I'm not even going to talk about cost overruns or whatnot, because that's a dead horse that's been kicked and flagged, I think, enough. But if we were to even invest in those fighter jets, are we actually saving lives? You tell me. Well, no, I'm going to tell you we're not saving lives, because if we invested that amount of money in the kinds of development missions that we ran in Kosovo, but which got shut down because CEDA's funding went out the door, if we invested that kind of money in the kind of gender projects that we ran in Rwanda, but which got shut down because the money dried up, or the kind of investment projects that we ran in Bosnia and development missions and democracy building, but which got shut down because the money went right out of DFAID. If we invested that money in those sorts of projects, I guarantee we're saving lives. But fighter jets, I'm not so convinced, because I've yet to see fighter jets save lives from an air mission only. In fact, in the Croatian instance, and certainly in the Bosnian instance, there were no lives saved whatsoever, and there was a no-fly zone along with active bombing. And we know that on the ground, we had genocide. So I'll leave it to the audience to explain that one to me.
To that, I think the other important issue that we should probably
Maybe stand up, Michael.
The other statement issue that we should mention is that even if we needed these fighter jets, do we need them now?
Exactly.
Given that the economy is very unstable, we just came out of recession and we're still not out of the woods as well. Do we need to spend another $30 billion, and it's still growing because we don't still know if that is the final bill?
Right.
So is this the right time to spend this money you know, when our economy is still stagnant and still not stable.
Or invest that money in usable schools on First Nations reserves, and we'd save a lot more lives as well, I would say, in the long term. Heather?
So I happen to work in the oil industry, like half of Calgary, but one of the challenges that I'm seeing, and I know that immigration is separate from foreign affairs, which is separate from international trade now, but I'd much rather see those together, because for me, when I look at what Canada is looking to do and what African countries are needing, it comes down to economy and knowledge. When I look at countries like Nigeria, where you have a historic and well-developed oil and gas industry with knowledgeable workers, PhDs in reservoir engineering. When I look at Egypt and Libya and Algeria and Morocco, again, countries with oil and gas industries that are well-developed with scholars and professors in oil recovery. When I look at where the projects around CO2 storage and enhanced oil recovery are happening, well, they're happening in Salah. What is Alberta actually trying to do right now in this province? Oh, geez, CO2 storage and enhanced oil recovery. How are we not integrating at a level to bring about, to use the knowledge training and the knowledge gap that we have in Canada to somehow create a trade? I guess for me, it's no longer about physical product, it's about actual knowledge trade. And I think until you have immigration, foreign affairs, and international trade as one, you don't actually start to connect those. You know, Nexen is in Yemen, Talisman is, gosh, well, I can't even remember the countries now, but y'all know them. You know, SNC Lavalin was in Libya, Suncor was in Libya. I was surprised by how surprised other Canadians were that our countries were, our organizations and our companies as Canadian companies were there.
And just as an addendum to that, I mean, the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, DFAID, was the exact department responsible for integrating these three branches. And that's the exact department that has been decimated over the last 5 years with government funding cuts. So I think your point is entirely apropos. What we've seen with the Conservative government, a complete slashing of the primary department responsible for the integration. Oh, what? So is this?
I think Adam was gonna.
Adam, were you about to say something?
Well, we'll follow up and then.
Sure, yeah.
I'm also in the oil industry. In the last couple of years, I've worked on a couple major projects in Africa. And I've worked for a number of the majors, 3 majors, and I had the opportunity to go over to Africa, and I didn't. And there's some smaller companies in Calgary. And not once has I've seen any federal involvement at all, ever. And I've dealt with these companies over there, with the people back. And partly, I must admit, it's the federal government doesn't understand the first thing about oil. The Department of Energy is not part of it. So they just don't, the federal government just don't understand things. And I'm disappointed because I'm working with the people, we're doing things. I had them drill wells, I had them do other things, and it worked. And a lot of the majors are working, but they're working on their own. They're not good at getting government support or backing or at all. Besides having a passport, it's about the only support you ever get. And so I'm happy that you're interested in this, and I hope you get in there and can make a difference in Africa, because they need the political involvement. Technical, yeah, they need the technical part, and it's around the world, but as important is the political support.
Well, Art, I really appreciate your point, because I would argue, and I think some of my panelists and colleagues would argue, certainly in the Liberal Party, there's a recognition that you need to have those trade negotiations, or certainly the commercial negotiations, and facilitate them in order to transfer knowledge to some extent.
At least the people should know each other.
That's right. Yeah,
and you should, you know,
absolutely.
at least besides the companies,
Absolutely.
because companies, I've got a dozen friends, or half a dozen friends that have worked over there, and I understand the problem, and I can't believe they've never been any government support.
Yeah. Well, I remember during the Chrétien era, when there were the Chrétien trade, Team Canada going over to China for the first time. And I recognize criticisms of you need to have human rights at the forefront of the agenda when you're negotiating with pernicious regimes. I recognize that. But at the same time, the modus operandi behind the Team Canada was that you start to facilitate between commercial industries and at least create those networks and those réseaux so that that facilitation happens and it's not totally enshrouded within the private industry sphere. So that the public, so that Canadians actually have some capacity to understand what is happening by Canadian companies abroad, which is also in some sense a human rights issue, right? And has ramifications economically, certainly in terms of GNP and GDP. So I think your point is apropos, and I think really, yeah, I think this is really the only party that's actually offering that, and that's my partisan quip about it.
Just a point of interest in dealing with other countries. I've had a lot of farmers that came to me in the last 3 weeks, and they gave me an earful. If you follow the price of grain right now, it's very high. Wheat, durum, and canola is very, very high. Can't move it. Those guys want their paycheck. They've been storing it, and now the price is high now, so help them out. The trains right now are only pushing potash from Saskatchewan. So you'll see the wagons go by, they're not train wagons. There's boats waiting in Vancouver to be loaded with grain. Japan needs it now, their food is contaminated. Now's the time when the price is high, let it go. Government is saying nothing. They contribute millions of dollars to keep the CPR going. Well, you know, a phone call to say, get it going. Our farmers need this. This is their paycheck. And a lot of these guys have mortgaged to the hilt for their combines, for their farms, for everything else. It's a simple thing like this that doesn't get done here. And it's going to help anywhere else. We are strong in food, we're strong in energy, we're strong in mining, we're strong in all kinds of things. And we can help other countries. And they don't have to be the big ones, by the way. It doesn't have to be China. It doesn't have to be just USA. Let's help some of the other ones and create some jobs there when they're receiving the goods or creating goods that we can be part of that.
A farmer friend went over with Cousteau, and he spent 2 months over there. And he made a difference in the way they did their food things over there. He said it didn't make a difference in the way they had.
But you got to be at the table. These guys are half asleep. I mean, I don't know what's going on.
I was wondering if you could comment on that gross violation of human rights regarding the man who was put into Guantanamo Bay and refused support by the Canadian government.
Omar
A
Kadar?
connection again with somebody who's not seen as entirely Canadian, right? And the way they treated him, and what are the possibilities of that coming back to haunt the Harbour government when he gets back to Canada? Is there any way?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think we probably all have views.
Well, from a legal point of view, this guy's a Canadian, should be in Canada. Let's treat him here. It's the same with Kader, but this is Kader, but the other guy, Mahar, same thing.
Omar Kadar?
What kind of story was this?
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, you don't protect the Canadian, you wouldn't even go visit him in jail for months on end, like it's ridiculous.
Deepak actually stood in the House and said that he got assurances from the U.S. that he was not being tortured, Omar Kadar, when he so clearly was. And that's part of the reason why I'm voting against Deepak, because of that one incident alone, let alone all the other reasons we should.
Canadians are Canadians.
I mean, it's not just that. I mean, how old was this kid?
He's a
Can we remind
15-year-old
ourselves
child.
this was a child. Right? We have legislation in this country protecting children and recognizing that children are not fully rational, sentient adults until they are 18. We choose that arbitrary age. We choose it for Canadians. Why we didn't stick to that for a Canadian caught abroad and things that clearly his family network got him involved in is beyond my comprehension. But the way we treat that child is how we can recognize the Canadian government will treat our children. And so I think we do need to wake up on that case. I think it is going to hurt the Harbour government, and I think it ought to, because it's an instantiation of where Canada failed to protect the rights of children, let alone Canadian citizens. And so just the question over there.
I don't have a question, I have a comment. My name is Adol. First, the Conservative government. I representative the Darfurian Congress Council of Canada. In 2007, I went to Ottawa asking all parliament members, they said we need conservative government to focus Africa, not just China, no Middle East, not just we are all Canadian. Just the women need help. Mr. Harper, he refused to meet us. Before last week, there is interest is attacking Libya. We have experienced people die for 7 years in Sudan. especially Darfur. Why conservative government no focusing protection civilian in Sudan? Libya, if it's case for oil, we have a 68 places oil in Sudan. And that's why conservative, we need change. How to change, you have to vote. Otherwise, ignoring Mr. He's a leader, any leader, but we need Canada safe and the conservative government in power. There is a lot of crime. We are in Calgary. We have 100 students here, and we have 150 young under 8 all arrested. Yeah. We're asking all issue in our police, there is nobody support. We're asking the federal, they forget it. We need change, NDP. We can vote liberal because the conservative is our area have to work well, and Mr. Harper is talking by the economy. We know economy. This economy is not just you can do by job. Economy is Africa. We have oil everything. We need this guy to be focused in Africa. It's not just conservative. Conservative is our people. We respect all the part here, but I'm not going to support for Mr. Harper.
Just to comment about crimes and when there's different nations that come in, there's different culture, sometimes religion. For example, some religions are very, very strong that women should not be touched by a man. You know, it's as simple as this. But police officers have to understand that. What is really needed when people come in with their different cultures is they need to have the seniors talk to the police. The seniors in your community, you have people in your community that are seniors, you know, elders that can help and make sure there is a transition that the police get the information. The police is trying very hard to have a multi-denomination between the police service. I'm sure in Calgary you'll have them. So you'll have some people that come from all kinds of backgrounds. But beyond that, there has to be a community involvement with the police to make sure that the culture is passed on to say, there's certain ways to get to that truth, there's certain ways to get to the evidence, and there's certain ways to make sure that people understand each other. So whether it's your group from Sudan and the police, but both sides has to understand how it works. And I think the elders have to help there.
But I would like to just add one comment though on the Darfur particular point, because with regards to Darfur, in 2007, the opposition parties demanded in the House of Commons action on Darfur. So the Liberals, the NDP, and the Bloc as well demanded action on Darfur, and we didn't get any action on Darfur because there was no agreement as to what ought to happen, how it ought to happen, and what we should be doing really at the international level. Over 180,000 people had already died in and around Darfur. How we can be shocked at the Rwandan genocide, how we can be shocked at Srebrenica, how we can be shocked that we completely ignored those massacres and turn around in 2007 and completely ignore what was happening in Darfur, I still have yet to comprehend, especially given that Calgary experienced the massive influx of Sudanese children, youth, and their families at that time. So our schools were facing the front line of what had happened in Darfur and the Sudan specifically. And I was just on the phone with the Center for Newcomers today, and the woman who runs that center was saying to me, you know what, if there's one message you can say tonight, it is that unfortunately for these families, they faced what they faced in Darfur and in the Sudan. They come here, and now their children are actually among the most vulnerable children here. And if you're looking at areas like Albert Park and Radisson Heights and Forest Lawn, where there are issues, there are reasonable issues with criminality, and these are young, vulnerable newcomers to this country, and they're not being engaged in an appropriate way at the school level, then what we're doing is really hindering a new generation of Canadians. And so the issue is not just what did we not do in Darfur, which is pathetic, because we didn't do anything, it's what are we continuing to not do here in our own high schools in this constituency to help the kids in those families. Sorry, there was one thing there.
It's good to be here. My name is Mario. I'm a past chair of Students Community, and I work at Center for Newcomers, second practitioner. So it is a fluctuation playing games actually. And the time I arrived here, it was 1990 in January. And then the election came up with Paul Martin, and then the whole thing came up, conservative. I have been around about 11 years now. And I did study a lot of background of how to live in Canada. Unfortunately, there are things written, but there is no practical plan. One thing I would like to comment on is last year I went to Sudan after being out for 21 years. And I started from Uganda, going to Juba, and all around. And one question I raised is, where is Canada? I know Canada is a peaceful country, that they don't want to get involved into the problem of separation of all of us. But we are not talking about separation, we talk about helping people. If about oil is there. But where are they? Some of them said, well, we work as partners, Samaritan, good Samaritan. So they partner and then they work under the table. And I said, okay, if you work under the table, I have a Canadian citizen. I'm holding it here, passport. And if I want to just to recognize myself among my people that are left that are Canadian, how would I be recognized? You see? And I met somebody from the task force who came from Ottawa. I challenged him. He couldn't say anything. Now, coming to Calgary. Calgary has been a place where I cannot say something about it because I have worked with a lot of non-profit sectors. And I'm involved with police, community dialogue, I'm with crime prevention, whatever they do here, you see. So what happened is, if the law for the child, for children is saying there is a right for a child. I raised this in one of the conferences. I said, if you collect all these Sudanese children, or vulnerable children, put them in prison, and then you bring them to the court. When a child just gets panicked, take him back. How many years will you keep this child? Of course, he will be an adult when he's 18. But if you happen to keep him in the prison for 6 years, while he was 12, you have destroyed his life. What is the right here? Who can I advocate? Who can advocate aside from me, from the society, Canadian society? Those who did not come 2 years, 10 years, who have been here for a long time. Is that something people could talk about? If we are to respond to this, we take them out, we create any kind of where we can rehab them. This is another advantage. Because when we came from a long distance, we did not come here to play dance. We did not come here just to go and eat in restaurants. Some sacrifice their education because of the children. Drop them down, come and work in warehouse. And at the end, you end up not even with half a penny in your hand. So, is this politics? I couldn't get it. But at last I realized, because when you talk to somebody representative like MLA, whatever, you cannot respond. So, would this chance be a period of change? If it is, let it be. So we see what will come next. So if there is an opportunity for us to make a change so that we can meet the needs of people who are suffering here, while the money is being sent to Pakistan, Afghanistan, all of this, let us do it. Satisfy your need and then save the other person around who is in need somewhere. So I think this is a golden chance for me because I have been around and I need to see who come next with a different company, different vision that would incorporate everybody so that people can have a chance for dialogue. So I'm worried because I'm volunteering in Women's Center. I'm there. I'm everywhere. But the problem is, whom would I pledge my concern so that they can respond to? So if the conservative would come up, because I was blind by then, let me see what is going to happen. But I will, by all means, talk to my community, and then we work for it. Thank you.
I would like to just add to that comment. We have all recently read in the newspaper the fact that even if you're a conservative, you must be upset by the fact that there's no representation by MPs here in Calgary who are conservative. Very little representation. And if we want one answer as to why Darfur, the Sudanese and the Sudanese population, which is conglomerated here in Calgary East particularly, has gotten no representation in the House of Commons, it's because the MPs here are not taking that issue to the House of Commons. So I hear what you're saying, sir, and I do think that the only way that you're going to change that political representation is by changing the politicians in power.
So if I can just add to that, you mentioned that if we're going to have change, we have to get out to vote. And then you, sir, you said that you're part of a community. Mobilize that vote.
Yeah, this is what I'm saying. If this is the, to me, if this is the only chance that my perception of negative thinking would change to something positive, and there's a chance for the body to change the system, let us go for it. And I will take it granted that I will talk to my community.
Please do. Yes.
That's the way to do it.
And in fact, at the beginning, you walked in a little bit after I'd said it, but as I said earlier on, there are 80,000 Africans, of which approximately are 15,000 from the Sudan in Calgary. And if they vote, they change the political landscape. It's that simple.
But the problem, we're talking all Canadian because it's not just part of the Sudan.
That's
we are all different nations. Canada has 145 countries around the world. The any party is coming to power, whatever, Liberal, NDP, well, in Green Party in this country, they have to respect different nations. And then you are under the leadership when you work in the focus of the country. Just as no economy. Economy is coming by the people. So this changing, Canadians, they have to vote the right leader. There is no just making crime. Because right now it's very dangerous. Even women can walk outside. We are in city, this great city. This harbor is here. These cities should be safe. That's why Canadian will be act whatever who is believed to want life as a safe. Business is the other. No health care. The future is going trouble. You don't have a more education. No education, crime is going to continue. Thank you.
Oh, right here?
One lady over there.
Oh, lady. Yes, lady. Where are we going? Oh, right. Sorry, I didn't see you. Right?
I work at Bow Valley College. I work in the Prospective Student Center. There are two of us who work there. And so I'm the one who sees initially all the students who come into the college. And we haven't had ESL funding since February, and we won't have any more funding until 2012. And to me, that's just so heartbreaking because we see so many students who, I mean, this isn't a foreign affairs issue, but it's an immigration issue. Students coming here who need to learn English so they can use their skills or gain skills for working in Canada. And I mean, that would be so beneficial to our government if we could provide that service, but funding hasn't been there, and it's hard to see new students who come to us and who are so defeated.
The Conservatives would rather put the money into mega prisons than education.
Yeah, and it's just, I mean, it's really heart-wrenching. So I just don't know where that money is going, and I think that's something that could be addressed and would be really beneficial to Canadians as well.
Oh, thank you.
So a few years ago, I was one of the teachers at Bow Valley College as English as a second language. And I volunteered for 4 months to teach English as a second language there. And the class was overflowing. There wasn't a single chair. They gave me the items that they wanted me to teach from, and I needed to go out and pay for photocopying so that I could do it. And it was just a ragtag. It was a really terrible experience. But I'm happy that I actually went through it because you're absolutely right. You actually see the short-sighted nature of what a lot of the power brokers, on a more than one level. I mean, it's not just a federal problem. It's other, even at the community level. And we actually see the impact of it. You know, not teaching ESL means that they're not going to, and we see this in the Muslim community, not teaching ESL means that they're not going to learn English, very, very simply. But when they don't learn English, they're going to move to a community where they're surrounded by like-minded people that could only speak their language. And they basically live and isolate themselves from the greater community, which causes problems with integration, which leads to acculturation, and it leads to isolation, and that leads to everything from extremism to depression, to suicide, to every single, to crime, and it all starts with a lack of foresight. It's not a difficult thing to make, to draw a line between education and crime. And when we're dealing death with jets, the purpose of jets, whether you want to talk about missions and fly zones and enforcement and all of that stuff, these aren't cargo planes bringing food and dropping rice and flour. They deal death. Their purpose is to destroy things or or show that they can destroy things. If that money, a fraction of it, was spent on virtually anything else in the public sector, we will have the multiplying effect is something palpable. We would have seen it right away. The problem is that there's not a whole lot of honesty here. It isn't. I don't think they think it's a good idea either to actually take this line. I don't actually believe that they believe it's a good idea. I believe that a lot of the decisions, and this is something that every single person has at one point or another mentioned about our federal government, our current federal government, is that they're very secretive. They're very secretive. There is no public conversation. And by public conversation, I mean, I don't even want to participate in the conversation, but have the conversation in a forum where at least if we're having the wool pulled over our eyes, we know. It would be great to just know that we're getting swindled. We don't even have that opportunity. And when it comes to the common sense solution that some of my friends in the back were talking about, trading information and learning from one another and all of this stuff, that's just not profitable. It's just not profitable to a few key people that are actually profiteering from the extraordinary lack of communication and overlap and so forth. And there's just there's actually two things I want to say. Of all of these places in Darfur, in Morocco and Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, all of these places where in the Congo, where we're really concerned as human beings with the death and destruction that's happening. How many of these countries, how many of these societies actually have an arms industry? These arms are coming from somewhere, and our silence is deafening. And we are not speaking up against the real, one of the real fundamental truths that happen in these places is that their bullets and their guns are manufactured by people that are too powerful to stop without having a mobilized and concerted effort.
80% comes from the G8 countries.
And that's a stone cold fact. That's a stone cold fact. And there's one last thing. I want to talk about one last thing. Women. That's like when we ignore half of the world's population, these movements that Lawrence Cannon has ignored, these movements are movements on the shoulders of women. When you go to Tahrir Square and Cairo and Maidan al-Tahrir, the majority of the people there are women. When you go to Damascus and Syria, the majority of people protesting against Boucher al-Assad, they're women. In Tunisia and Algeria, they're women. In the Sudan, they're women. And we give a lot of lip service to women's rights, but when we're silent on issues like this, we're basically feeding them to the wolves. And when we're talking about education, the people that affects first, when we actually sit back and let this stuff happen to them, the people that are affected worse are the women and the children. And the men are going to be affected because the women and the children are affected. So I really appeal to anybody that has women's issues as something that's important to them, to actually look at it from that angle. Because the conversation has been so convoluted to be about religion, land, oil, politics, personalities, all kinds of stuff. I mean, if we just pare it down and just just get right down to the brass tacks, it's about the fact that when we're not supporting these people, we're actually throwing away our human rights and female rights credentials right out of the window. And this is coming from an Arab Muslim, guys.
I actually want to add though to what you're saying, because I know you said it's an immigration issue, but immigration issues are foreign affairs issues. And I'll tell you what, we all like to believe that as Canadians we're well traveled, we all have passports, we jet set across the world, but it's just not true. And when you go door to door, people very often have not traveled very far and wide. And your understanding of the foreign world within which you exist and what your government ought to be doing in the foreign world is very often shaped by the local environment within which you exist. And the people I meet going door to door, those who have not had the opportunity to travel around or to live abroad or to work abroad, often develop their sense of what is going on in the Middle East or in Africa based on the few experiences